Welcome to Gumption. I have the jar.
Of mystery. Dun, 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 dun.
So we
That's
can find out what we're talking about. Hopefully it's something we have something to say about.
Oh, I hope so.
When is there
The
anything
first wave of feminism and Queen Victoria.
Say that again?
The first wave of feminism and Queen Victoria.
Goodness me.
So back in Victorian England, a whole bunch of women got together and decided they wanted to be allowed to vote. And the idea behind this topic, long ago, was I had a paper that I wrote once, a very long time ago, like 10 years ago, about how Victoria, just by being a queen instead of a king, even though she didn't necessarily make any policy decisions that were any different from something a king would have made, the fact that she was a woman and she was like the leader of the country, I think inspired a lot of these feminists to actually try and do something instead of sitting around talking about doing stuff, because she was actually a working queen. She was the last proper working monarch.
Right, because very often with queens, they would marry them to a king in his own right, and then the king would essentially rule both countries.
Well, and that wasn't the law in England, and that caused a little bit of conflict for a while. But it was also in the middle of Queen Victoria's reign was when Parliament voted that the Prime Minister would be elected instead of appointed. So she spent the first several years of her reign with advisors that she had appointed. So she wasn't as much of a figurehead. She was actually doing work.
I didn't know that. So in your reading, did it suggest they did that because they didn't trust her as a queen?
No. It was a like left wing versus right wing thing. And I think there was a general feeling of we want more power. Like average people wanted more control over their lives and more direct influence in the decisions that were made.
Could it also be like the beginning, or the Industrial Revolution changed a lot of stuff too, the way people thought about stuff? And there was a lot of emphasis on science and things like that. So it wasn't just, it was that she was there and she was this kind of person
She was
who
there
was...
and she was this woman who was actually doing a job that most men would, that would have been done by men in most countries, but because England has specific rules about queens, she had to do the job. And I think that inspired a lot of the women who were working to want the same rights as the men they were working alongside in the lower classes.
Well, at least
there were in the Industrial Revolution, there ended up being a lot of factory workers who were women. Especially if you were raped or something and ended up with a kid, you would get put in a factory. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with you after that. You had to fend for yourself.
I think women were working at that time anyway, though. Like, you think of all the seamstresses and the washerwomen and the maids in the houses.
And a little bit more complicated. So there's a really good book called The Dressmaker. Oh man, I don't remember who wrote it because there's multiple books of this variety. But a lot of there were prejudices against women even in the fashion industry.
I think there were just a lot of prejudices against women.
In general, yes, there were.
In general, being able to have any responsibilities in society.
And I think a lot of, this is a lot of Enlightenment era philosophy was going on as well. And I think the men and the women were reading all of this Enlightenment philosophy, and the women were like, well, why can't we be enlightened too?
Yeah, and it basically it was a movement forward in employment and also in education because many women were not educated um, beyond, simple skills for housemaking, like cooking and maybe being able to
Or
write
or
their own
they
signature.
were or they were trained to be they were trained to work in a very specific niche, like in
Yeah.
you could be a housemaid or a lady's maid, or you could work in a factory for abysmal wages and abysmal working conditions. But they're, it was even worse then than it was um, even in the middle 1900s, because if you were a lady's maid and you got pregnant, you were fired and you were sent to work in the factories, and your kid was sent to an orphanage if you survived the birth. But like getting married wasn't something you were allowed to do, and you could maybe sometimes get away with it if the family you were working for was really nice, but you still couldn't have kids.
Until you were married, yeah?
No, if you
You
were
weren't even
working in
supposed to have
domestic service,
followers.
you were not allowed to have kids even if you were married.
Mm. If you're in domestic service, which I can kind of understand because they were pretty
But
demanding,
they were
weren't they?
like that in so one of the interesting things in The Dressmaker by Posey Graeme Evans.
Is it a non-fiction book?
It's fiction, but it's based off of someone who really existed.
Okay.
One of the interesting parts in there is she's working as um basically she's the one who sketches out all the pattern pieces um for the people who cut them out. So this is very early in the industrial revolution of fashion design. So instead of custom making everything, they're trying to attract the lower middle class and mass produce things that people could buy in stock sizes. And she's working there, and she ends up married, and she gets pregnant, and they fire her. She's their best sketchist, and they fire her because she got pregnant and she was married.
Mm.
Oh, that was absolutely common, and they
So
were
even
probably
even
scandalized that she didn't quit.
right, and like if this is the sort of she was the person sort of working alongside the factory workers in a different industry, so not making the textiles but taking the textiles and making clothes
But
and
maybe that's more to do with the view of women at the time, is that women were supposed to stay home with the
right.
family. So as soon as
Right.
you got pregnant,
So either
that
you
was
had to stay
your
home
focus.
with the family, I or you work, but there's this implication that if you're working and you're a woman and you're married, then you shouldn't have kids because you're working. And if you're married and you want to have kids, then you can't work. And that was a much
Mm.
more extreme viewpoint than it was before the 60s and all of the changes in the US when
Yeah, so, but we're talking about the 1800s here where it wouldn't have even
right.
been, like, that just wouldn't have even been shocking. That was just, that's what happened.
Well,
You know
no,
what I mean?
in
Like,
the UK, it was 1882. I'm looking this up. I did not remember the
yeah,
state. That it was
yeah.
1882 Married Property Act that a woman actually could keep some of her own money. I
That was
mean,
1882.
yeah, it was
Yeah, so
late.
Mm.
that's probably a result of the suffragettes.
Mm.
And once they got the ability to vote, they probably helped pass that law.
Because we were talking about Queen Victoria and how, because it says here that basically she after Prince Albert died in 1861, she was so devastated that she basically took herself out of public life, and that's when because she isolated herself, that diminished the popularity of the monarchy and encouraged the growth of the Republican movement. So basically, it kind of was her that set in motion the kind of whole
but it wasn't just that she took herself out of the public eye. It was also, that this happened before Albert died, that her prime minister became someone who was elected instead of
when was that then?
I don't know. Let's see.
Anyway, I suppose large silences is probably not conducive to a good podcast as we all look stuff up desperately. Anyway, have you ever a lot of what I know or think I know about this time is based on what I've read in fiction novels, which potentially are
so I did a lot of non-fiction research when I was writing this paper 10 years ago, and I remember the main points, but the dates and stuff are...
Okay, so there was an 1892 election. No.
Because I'm looking at George Sand, who was a woman. A lot of people didn't know she was a woman. And she wanted to be judged upon her talents and not only as a woman author. So that's why she wrote under a man's name. Oh, this is interesting, and I don't know if this is true. I'm just reading someone's opinion. That following in George Sand's footsteps, other women began to write like her and took on male names, but they lacked the education that the male authors had. And so they often would publish, it says, their first drafted idea.
Well, according to Wikipedia, Queen Victoria wrote an average of 2,500 words a day in journals. She journaled her whole life. Oh my gosh,
she has the best journals.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And they're full of ridiculous stuff too. But yet, so much family stuff.
Yeah.
She was very concerned about her children. And she would write about it, especially like if her children were not behaving, she would be like, oh, I'm so concerned. But, other stuff in there too. So it's kind of funny to see all the different things that went through her mind. You really wonder if any king anywhere ever wrote down, oh, my daughter is not behaving. I wonder what could be done with her.
That's so funny.
King Henry VIII probably thought it a few times, but I doubt he wrote it down.
No, exactly.
I think I'm remembering that Queen Victoria's journals, some of them were just recently released, like a year or two ago, online, was it? Or maybe you have to go to see it.
No, launched online. The Victoria and Albert Museum.
No, they're launched online.
They were launched online. That's kind of cool.
13 of the original diaries.
Oh so my goodness. I think the
40,000 pages of her journal.
40,000 pages. It's just crazy. It's kind of interesting, eh?
It is.
I want you to post the link to that so that we can all go and look that up. Read that.
Okay. Well, this is just a BBC article, but this is funny. It says, in an 1839 entry, she described Prince Albert as beautiful after first meeting him. So clearly, okay. So her first entry, that they know about, was at the age of 13, and then she kept her journals up until 10 days before she died.
Wow.
So she really seriously had stuff to say, and she probably had nobody to say it to except her journal.
Yeah.
We were just talking about people with charisma, right? And there's a comment here saying Victoria was physically unprepossessed. She was unprepossessed. Oh my God. Anyway, that word. She was stout, dowdy, and no more than 5 feet tall, but she succeeded in projecting a grand image. So she was kind of one of those people that she wasn't necessarily kind of, you know,
Yeah. I think
But
that's
she
what
could
makes good
command the
leaders
eye.
good
She was
leaders.
probably taught that.
yeah, from the
Um,
cradle, I suppose. She experienced unpopularity during her first years of her widowhood, but was well liked during the 1880s and 1890s. And she embodied the empire as a benevolent matriarchal figure. And it was
so
only on the release of her diary and letters that the extent of her political influence became known to the wider public. So she was behind the scenes doing stuff, and
she
the
Now,
was
and
see,
the
the
that's very
yeah.
telling, though. People, if they had known how powerful she was, people would maybe have disliked her more because that was
mm,
not inappropriate. You had to find that out later, after it was no longer a political liability for her to be known as powerful.
There was a
mm,
lot of drama when she married Prince Albert because he was German.
Well, they're so
they
afraid. I
were
mean, the
constantly
British are
married
so
into the
afraid of that.
Germans.
Yeah,
They
well,
were.
they were cousins, so like she was German too, but she had grown up in England and like it was
That's quite common, though. I thought they were always marrying into the French and German aristocracy.
Yes,
it
they
was common,
were.
but there was still
They
like
they were probably a little too close because that's why they have their children
Uh,
had the blood
hemophilia.
disorder.
Hemophilia thing.
Um, so the Reform Act in 1832, I believe, is what made the prime minister actually be elected and be a job that required talking to people instead of just doing stuff.
Mm.
And
Very
then there
interesting.
was an election that happened. Ugh, I'm forgetting who it was, but I think it was um, whoever was after Sir Robert Peel got elected, and that was dramatic um, because whoever came after Peel was of a different political party. Then Victoria had very specific political ideas, but she didn't let anybody know about it because she wanted to be seen as fair and not taking sides.
Yeah.
Um,
She was had several people trying to kill her. Did you know this? That she's
yeah,
had several
yeah,
assassination attempts on her life. I suppose that's didn't even think. She sustained an injury when she was assaulted by one of them, and she had multiple people shooting guns at her as she drove along um
yeah,
the streets. Oh my God. Anyway,
yeah.
Well, I mean,
I
there
just
were a lot of people who wanted women to have the vote and, act rights and stuff, who really were angry at her for not being more proactive about that.
Right, but she
no, this was
wanted
all
to not
men.
be seen to be taking sides, and so I think her personal views, like this is why I am very interested to read her journals that you just told me about, because I think her private opinions about what was going on are very different from what people thought they were.
About the
About
suffragette movement.
everything. About
Mm.
votes, about industrial revolution, about um her the assassination attempts. I mean,
In what way? What do you think she was presenting a front to the
well,
public?
I think she was trying to seem to be a neutral power. So this is, part of her benevolent matriarch image. She wasn't going to instigate a movement to push to one side or the other. She was trying to make sure things functioned and kept going how they needed to based on compromise and majority opinion.
Okay. I always thought that she was fairly
I guess she may
outspoken.
have been affected by war and not wanted more war, although there were certainly wars during her reign.
Yeah. Anyway, clearly, she was the longest reigning. No, she was. Was she previously the longest reigning queen, and now Queen Elizabeth?
I think Elizabeth.
Elizabeth has just overtaken her.
There was a celebration about it, I think.
What about Queen Elizabeth II, or?
Yeah, I'm looking for Robert Peel. Nope, it's not.
That's one of the assassins.
Maybe if you do Sir Robert.
Oh.
No, I'm on.
Prime Minister.
There's a list of prime ministers that goes in order, and like,
He's not on it?
I can't find who I'm looking for. No.
Oh, so there's a Diamond Jubilee scrapbook.
For Queen Elizabeth.
Pictures, of Elizabeth.
Oh, there he is.
No,
Victoria. They've been doing. Oh, Victoria. Okay, I was going to say. See, it's interesting because you think about Queen Elizabeth, and she's got a sort of interesting the way people view her as well. Like, it's a really controlled kind of environment. I mean, I suppose it's different now to the way Queen Victoria would have been able to hide her private life from her.
People expect Elizabeth to actually reign. So Victoria would probably have been a little bit. Her citizens might have been appalled at her actually, taking too much part of this political stuff. Whereas
so Victoria still had to sign anything.
No, I don't think.
Voted on. She had to sign it still to make it be law. It wasn't just automatically law because Parliament passed it.
Right, but one of the ways they talked about her was that she had the counsel of her husband and the counsel of these other men. So often when she was written about, it was framed as, and the subtext was, "Don't worry, we know she's a woman, but she listens to these men. She does what they say."
Do you know that kind of reflects how it reflects how when we talked about Eleanor Roosevelt and how she was it was always he's in charge, but she's just his representative. And whereas with Queen Victoria, I mean, she was actually technically in charge. And it's interesting that was the system. I mean, if they didn't want women to be in charge, then why was it that she was allowed to, as part of the monarchy system?
I think
that when it came
that goes back to Elizabeth I.
Yeah?
Yeah.
How so?
Because I think so Elizabeth I had a lot of pressure on her to marry, but if she married anyone, then they would become king and rule for her. And she didn't want that to happen. She switched it so that they would. She didn't want that to happen, so she refused to marry anybody.
But now it's like they marry and they become a prince.
I think she.
So did she change it or something?
Started the process of changing it. I don't know if she actually changed it, but I think she is the reason why it was changed.
Well, Britain has always allowed queens.
But
queens are more destabilizing.
First, if you were a queen, you would only be ruling in your own right if your husband was off at war in another country.
Not in Britain.
Yes.
No. And
yes.
that's
I read about huge,
Kelly. No, I know. You know Maud, right? So Maud is where this all came to a head. And so Stephen ended up on the throne because people didn't want a queen on the throne. But Maud was actually legally queen.
Right. But
they didn't actually change any of the laws that way. And when Elizabeth's the first's sister Mary was on the throne, she actually married another king, and another reigning king, and that was who was
I
it?
think
Spain
she had
or
married
France?
That reigning king before she became queen.
No, she married him after, and she married him to stabilize because she wanted to make the country Catholic again, and she needed some big guns to help her with that. And that's actually
but I think
he
didn't become the reigning ruler of England because he was the reigning monarch of a different country already.
Right, and
And
I
that
think
was
that was an
probably
interesting thing.
legally determined in their marriage contract before they
Oh,
got married.
definitely. All that stuff was in the contract because at that time
Because
the Parliament got very
it was
powerful
definitely an
and they
issue
had a
for
lot to
Elizabeth
say.
the First.
Um, yeah, no, I mean, one of the things when you look at, I mean, and this is horrendously researched and depicted, but that queen, there's actually a TV show, The Red Queen or The White Queen. I think it's The White Queen.
Those are
Uh,
based off of Patricia McGregory.
I'm
Can I
not sure who it
remember?
is. I know who it is. It's
But
not her, a
those are
different.
not those TV shows are based off of novels. They're not based off of fact.
No, no, I know. And the novels were better researched. The TV shows are horrendous, but the interesting thing about watching them is that you really do see that it's very personal. That all of these people keep circling around. You know, all of these people who are getting deposed and having their lands taken away, and then a generation later, their child gets it back from some other king, and it's really just a bunch of family squabbles. But every time the family squabbled, the
There was
the
something that
lords
happened
got
that created
stronger.
an innovation. So
Yeah.
the British created a lot of legal innovations um, over the course of British history. And one of them was that if there were no men, if the order of succession, if there were no brothers, the oldest daughter would become queen.
And
Um,
they codified and recodified it, but the truth is, if they hadn't wanted Victoria on the throne, they would have found a way to get rid of her. You know, and I don't mean kill her.
well,
They just thought she
I
was
think there were a bunch
malleable.
of people, but like none of her. I mean, her mother and her mother's male advisor were trying very hard to control her in the beginning.
Yes. Now, this is interesting. I did not know this, but this is how unlikely it was that she would be queen. She was born at Kensington Palace, the only child of Edward, Duke of Kent, fourth son of King George III.
Yeah.
Fourth son.
But
She's
you're
the daughter
forgetting
of the
that
fourth son.
the Napoleonic Wars like had happened. So people died. A lot of people died in the Napoleonic Wars.
hmm.
And I think that's part of what happened to her uncles.
Yeah, I can't remember what all happened with them, but it was kind of bizarre. I do remember that people were surprised. I mean, it was not.
I
It
mean,
was
her
kind of
dad
like, okay,
died.
well, I guess we have to have her. Was kind of, the way. And after, if when a king has four sons, the populace assumes there's going to be a king on the throne, and so it was kind of a big change for them, and yet
And
they
she
wanted
was very, very
stability.
young when she
Oh, Soup, wasn't she like 18?
yeah, there was so there's a really good A&E miniseries called Victoria and Albert. And the actress who plays Victoria, her first name is Victoria too. But there's a really it's a really good dramatization of like between a year or two before she takes the throne and when Albert dies. Um, and George III invited Victoria and her mom to one of his birthday parties in this movie. I don't know if he actually did in real life. He probably did. I mean, they're related, and she was his heir presumptive. And her mom didn't want to let her go because her mom didn't want her uncle to have more control over her. Um, and there's a conversation that George has with Victoria, or I think I could be remembering it wrong. But basically, there's a conversation that happens where George says that he has to not die before her 18th birthday. because if he does die before her 18th birthday, then her mom would be regent.
Oh yeah, and
And
they
George
did not
and
like.
her mom were like arch enemies, essentially.
Okay, so this is really cool. So I'm looking at her Queen Victoria's scrapbook, and there's a letter that the tutor, who's a baroness, I guess, um, it tells her that she's closer to the throne than she thought, and the handwriting is beautiful, but I just went to the PDF version so I could actually read it. I asked Your Majesty's leave to cite some remarkable words of Your Majesty's when only 12 years old, while the Regency Bill was to be settled through William the Fourth. I'm not good with and I have no idea what a Regency Bill is. 7 days previous, I spoke to the Duchess of Kent, who's Victoria's mom, about the necessity that now, for the first time, Your Majesty ought to know your place in the accession. Her Royal Highness agreed with me, and I put the chronological table into the historical book. When Mr. Davies was gone, the Princess Victoria opened, as usual, the book again, and seeing the additional papers said, I never saw that before. So she's 12 when she's learning how close she is to the throne. It was not thought necessary you should, Princess, I answered. I see, I am nearer to the throne than I thought. So it is, madam, I said. Blah, blah, blah. They write a lot. After some moments, the princess resumed, Now, many a child would boast, but they don't know the difficulty. There is much splendor, but there is more responsibility. This is too funny. This is too funny.
Mm.
I'm not going to read this whole letter, but I mean, it's kind of cool to see it in its very perfect penmanship. Oh, okay. So, but your Aunt Adelaide is still young and may have children, which is capitalized. And of course, they would ascend the throne after their father, William IV, and not you, Princess. And, she says, well, of course. And if it was so, I should never feel disappointed, for I know by the love of Aunt Adelaide bears me how fond she is of children, capitalized. Oh, this is sad. So I guess they had another, it says, when Queen Adelaide lost her second little princess, she wrote to the Duchess of Kent, my children are dead, but yours live, and she is mine too. That's really creepy. But, I mean, I suppose it's reassuring to the mother. Oh, my goodness, could you imagine being 12 years old and suddenly finding out that if your aunt and uncle don't have sons, you might be king?
Queen.
I don't think that would have been that shocking to them in that social circle.
I mean, obviously she knew her uncles and everything, but I don't know. Do you think she would have known? Well, from what I've read about her mother, she would have.
I mean,
her mother
it was
raised
saying
her.
that where is it? I have to go back. I'm on the scrapbook now too, and there's this page about her. It's like her report card. By the age of 6, Princess Victoria was studying a regular timetable of lessons supervised by her principal master, Reverend George Davies. This report from July 1828 shows that she was studying a wide variety of subjects at 9 years old, including geography, arithmetic, drawing, and natural history.
She was very well educated.
But she was being educated because her mom was hoping.
Oh, I think she was well educated because her mom was hoping for a good marriage, even if she didn't take the throne.
I mean, but she was being educated to rule, regardless of whether it was England or somewhere else.
Yeah, no, definitely, I think that's true.
But she was a princess, so I suppose that was kind of expected, wasn't it? There was a small pool from which to choose, and you married other princes and princesses.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kept within your own social circle, and that was quite a rarefied one.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, you weren't going out as princess and rubbing elbows with the hoi polloi.
No.
But
you had a very specific life.
And a lot. I mean, I don't think I'd want to be a princess. I mean, we have this Disney-fied version of princess as somebody who,
But
can
being a real
order whatever
princess
she
is really hard
wants.
work. This is why, okay, so
And boring.
So I don't know very much about Kate Middleton at all, but I heard from somewhere, this could be complete rumor, but I heard that she didn't want to accept William's proposal the first time because of exactly what we're talking about, because of how difficult it is to be that kind of public figure and also do stuff that's meaningful and still have, like, a personal life.
Well, she doesn't really have a personal life now, and she gets told by people what she's going to name her children and where she's going to go and who she's going to see and how she's going to act.
Regimented, and I think it's equally regimented for the men in that family, and I think that's one of the reasons why there's all sorts of issues, and have been for I don't even know how long, ages. For over a century. I mean, if you think about it, Edward abdicated because he didn't want the responsibility and he didn't want to live up to other people's expectations of what he should and shouldn't do and who he should and shouldn't be with and all of that, and that's why what's his name?
He wanted to marry who he wanted to marry.
Right. And so he did, and he had to give up the throne in order to do that, but he wouldn't have been a very good... Well, there were a lot of people who didn't think he would be a very good ruler, even though he was a popular person. And I think there are similar sentiments about Prince Charles right now. He might
but they're not really ruling anything.
But there's rumors about whether he would.
They're not actually ruling anything these days, though, are they? They're just figureheads who get a lot of money.
But they have a lot
at the risk of showing my belief system around a monarchy.
They have a lot of social power, and they have a lot of power to draw people to specific charities or to specific causes.
As they're kind of like a celebrity, and I mean in England they're pretty popular. English. My mother-in-law is English, and she loves them. She stayed up and watched all the weddings.
Celebrities often, at least in the U.S., because there's more celebrities, not a single one of them has to be in the center of everyone's attention all the time.
Okay, so I want to say something interesting. Okay, so Victoria ruled a lot.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
You know what? That is not the way I meant it.
I'm teasing you. I'm teasing you.
But I know, but it did sound like that, and I didn't mean it that way. I'm looking at the family tree, which is kind of cute. And so I'm looking at the children's birth dates, which I had never really looked at before. So her eldest daughter, Victoria, was born in 1840 in November. Her next child was born less than a year later in November 1841.
Wow.
Next one was born in spring of 1843. Next one, summer of 1844. And then she got a little bit of a break. And so it was May of 1846 before she had the next one. And then 2 years before the next one. And then 2 years before the next one. And then, big break, 3 years before the next one. And then 4 years before the last one. So she had children. First child was born in 1840. Her last child was born in 1857. 17 years of giving birth and being a queen at the same time.
How many kids?
Oh my God.
7 of
she
them.
had, this is
9. She's got 9 children. Yeah.
And I'm not sure she probably...
Okay, I have no sympathy for her. I have no sympathy for her because my grandmother had 8 kids in 10 years. So, no sympathy.
Oh, I thought you said 18 kids in 10 years.
No.
Oh, was your grandmother also queen?
No, but...
Was she doing the queen stuff as well? Huh? Was she?
My grandmother was pretty awesome.
My
grandmother...
the children as opposed to handing them off to nannies.
My grandmother was one of 14 children, and she was one of the older ones, and she was taken out of school, wasn't allowed to go to school past like a really young age, and she cooked for all of them. So her job in the family was to cook for the whole family, And she was a really awesome cook. Like she was, I mean, obviously I only know her when she was, and then she went off and got married and had her own family. But can you, that's what happened. You had maybe not to Queen Victoria and her family, but you down a bit in the old hierarchy. You
They
had
didn't
lots of
need that
kids
girl
because you.
educated. They needed her
No.
home working. I know.
Yeah, looking after the
It
others
did
in the
happen.
family. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, that's one of the things that you see. I don't know if they show it on Downton Abbey, but I've seen it on some of the other shows like that. Is that the working class, the people who are working below stairs, they're actually sending a portion of their money home to their
to their
parents,
family.
and that's
Mm,
expected.
mm.
And that might tie
So the
into
parents don't want them
why
to get married.
women who were working were not supposed to be having kids, because they were supposed to be supporting the rest of their family.
Yeah.
Yeah, there
And
was
you
a
think
lot of
about
pressure.
there were expectations and all sorts of. You think about, I mean, maybe this is slightly higher class where they had the second son who was supposed to go off and be part of the clergy, and one was supposed to be a soldier.
Yeah.
There was the first one who was the heir, and then there were the others had certain roles that they were supposed to do, and maybe they were also about earning money and bringing it back in, depending on the level of the family and stuff.
Well, on the level of the family, it was, you were the heir, so you were trained to um, run everything. Then
Well,
the
and it's
second
also
son
like
would go into,
there's
what was the second son? Was military or clergy?
it
Mm.
depended on the
Because
family, I
there was
think.
a reason for that.
Yeah.
Because it
Well, and
was, they were supposed to support their brother in, in his
well, it
role, and in the
wasn't just
military
that, but
too.
they were also supposed to do well enough at whatever it was that they could acquire lands and the ability to support their own family, because they weren't going to inherit the land. And
Right,
then the
but
training
everything
the
was
training you
really
could
to
get
bring that main
for
family
being a really
land.
good soldier or being a really good clergyman or being a really good estate owner is very different. Owning an estate has a lot of business skills that you need to know and a lot of farming skills that you need to know. Whereas doing being in the military, you have to understand, strategy and logistics and stuff like that, like
How to
military
shoot a
type
gun
stuff.
and how to ride a horse.
How to shoot a gun, how to
I
ride a
don't know that.
horse, how to make sure that your people get to where they need to be, how to
Yeah. Well,
think about
military,
and outmaneuver other people. So it's
yeah,
different.
But I
it's
don't
leadership
necessarily
skills.
think they were all automatically good at it just because they were sent off to be the
No,
military.
no, they weren't.
No.
But I
So
think the
they,
three sons would have gotten different education.
Oh, definitely,
Like
definitely.
their tutors would have been, okay, you're the oldest, so we're going to teach you XYZ. You're the second one, you're going to go into the clergy, so we're going to teach you A, B, and C. And you're the third one, and you're going to go into the army, so we're going to teach you, F, Y, and G.
Right.
So I think some things would have overlapped, like the basic reading and
Oh, well,
writing and math would have overlapped, but specifics.
well, and there was
but there
always
was also
very
the idea
fair.
that the eldest could have died. I mean,
Right.
they did need the
Right,
second and third
right.
to be
So like
prepared to
everyone
take
would
over.
have I think there was a basic level of education that they all had to have. Um, but there are things that a soldier needs to know that a state owner doesn't, and vice versa. So I
Well,
think
I
once
mean,
they
I
got
think
to a certain age, they started
a royal
socializing.
family, or in a landed family, it was a lot about. I mean, even though they were, presumed that they would go earn enough to support their own family, they were expected to support that land and family property first and foremost, with their skills and their loyalty. And of course, obviously, we know plenty of feuding brothers from English history, so obviously they didn't all do that. But I think that was the general expectation that everybody started out with is, well, the more boys we have, the better, because we'll have a lot of people who are going to protect our interests. And that's really what caused most of the problems among the, my goodness, I did some research in the Henry VIII's court for a story I was writing, and it was like, oh my goodness, these people all had like grudges because someone in this family had snitched on somebody in that family and got them beheaded at the
If
tower.
you watch The Tudors, it's I'm sure it's completely historically inaccurate, but it's really interesting to see because as you watch it, there are certain individuals who rise to power and who fall from power over the course of the seasons. Um, and they gain land and titles and privilege when they rise to power, and then that all gets taken away from them when they lose power. But their whole
Yeah, but
motivation
if
for
you look
rising to power
longer,
is so that they have land to give their family, so their family won't be destitute.
but that's if you look longer term, like if you look over a 200-year period, a lot of times it's people who think they're reclaiming their birthrights. So it's very cyclical. Families,
Yeah.
and sometimes you'll get new blood. I mean, like that's what the White Queen is about, is that's kind of new blood that people thought the king married beneath him, and then the queen had lots of children, and the princes were killed in the tower, and all of that horrible stuff. But basically, everybody's nose was out of joint that the king dared to marry out of all of these squabbling relatives.
But he did it on purpose because then he wouldn't have
Well, because
other
she was a
squabbling
witch.
relatives on.
No, she was a witch. Didn't you see the series? Of course, she was just a witch. She was bewitched.
Well, everyone who falls in love with a woman who
is bewitched. You're right.
Yeah. I mean, that's Anne Boleyn's witch. Totally.
They just loved to call women witches back then. It was so annoying. But they actually really believed it.
Lucrezia Borgia was a witch.
No, obviously. They really believed it. It was not.
No, they did. They did actually.
Just accusation.
But I think in many instances it wasn't that you had to do something witch-like to be called a witch. You just had to do something that they didn't want you to do, whoever they happened to be.
Well, it's like the Salem witch trials. That when you look at the women who were accused there, it was mainly women who were in a position of power but yet vulnerable, or influence, maybe I should say, but vulnerable. We just make really good targets.
Control who they had to deal with. It's all about control. It's always all about control.
Well, it's really interesting though, because I know I had for a long time this idea of like this straight line of kings that came down from one family to another family to another family. And then I started learning the history, and it's just so fascinating how some of them became king, and you're like, what? What were they drinking when they did that? But there's some little shred of justification that they could do it. And England wasn't the only one that had female queens, but it seemed to do it a little better than some of the other countries.
Certainly historically, I think all the monarchies now are mostly the same. I mean, you don't hear that much about the other ones because none of the other ones had the British Empire.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, they've been more figureheads. Most of the others have been more figureheads for a really long time, but that doesn't mean they don't supply marriage material.
And it's really interesting to look at different constitutional monarchies in different countries, because in Norway, they have a king and a royal family, and they did that on purpose because they wanted everyone to like them. So when Norway formed their constitution, they were like, okay, we're going to be a constitutional monarchy. So all of the political power is held by parliament, which is elected people. But we're not a democracy, so the people who are monarchies won't hate us either because we have a king.
Okay.
But their royal family lives like any other person in Norway does. Like they consider they consider the royal family to be equal to everyone else.
Oh, that's kind of cool.
But then you look at Sweden, and they have a much more structured aristocracy because they were historically their own country. They were historically a monarchy.
I mean, I think that's where you get it, because England has had kings for a really long time, and it lends an air of stability and age to them. And so, because I know,
I don't know if it's you
they've
could say
talked about.
stability.
I don't think the stability comes from the monarchy. I think the stability comes from the country. I mean, because France had a monarchy and Prussia had a monarchy and the Austro-Hungarian Empire had an epic monarchy
Well,
that
okay,
like
so
took over
so
the
France
entire
and Russia
universe.
are the examples of why Britain hesitated to do away with their monarchy. I mean, Russia was bloody, 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 and France, of course, was also bloody. And then they had all that, you know, oh, we're, go through 7 different kinds of governments and then go
Right, but
back to
like
kings.
the rest of everywhere else also had really bloody transitions. The US had a bloody transition.
We had, comparatively, we had a relatively bloodless, and because um,
Well, it was
for
one
a
war
country.
instead of five, but it was still a war.
Oh, it was definitely a war, and I mean, I'm not saying it was trivial. I mean, people died in it. It could have been, if Britain had been paying attention, it could have really, we'd still be a colony
Well,
in
I think there was a lot of uh, fortuitous circumstances
And I
uh,
actually think there
to
were a
the
lot of people who
Revolutionary War.
recognized that, and they worked hard to keep it civil.
Well, and that's the other interesting thing is I think a lot of revolutions like the ones in France and the ones in Russia were started by the lower classes, the people who had less access to education, and I think the U.S. And the Norwegian ones happened. They were led by people who had high levels of education, and so they were looking at, okay, what are the Greek systems, what are the Roman systems, what systems have worked historically, what systems have not worked historically, and they were able to actually
I'm not
develop a system
100%
based
sure.
off of historical
I haven't studied it, but the difference between the French Revolution and the American Revolution is that is almost one of gumption, so to speak, is Americans did not have as big a class divide, and they also felt, in terms of people who lived in America, they also felt like, they weren't like there weren't dukes and princes coming to live in America. So the stratification of America was much less,
Mm.
and the people who were supposedly the ruling class didn't live there, so they didn't care about them as much. They was like, you're not
Right,
here, we
right,
don't
but
care.
There
like
was a lot of
In
anger
there
France, that
in
was a
the
was
lot
French.
of education amongst the Americans.
there was a
So
lot of
like
education amongst the
Robespierre.
French. Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
I think there were people
yeah,
who were educated who were
there
part
were
of that.
educated people in France, but a lot of the educated people had to manage mobs
Yes,
of
I think it
uneducated
was the mobs. Yes.
or
It was, but that was because of long years of resentment and anger, right?
right,
They were
right.
basically being
So
fed
when you're
nothing
trying to
while they were all
a
eating.
mob who's going to come and kill you if you don't do what they say, you have a lot less power, regardless of your education.
Yeah, so
And
maybe it wasn't necessarily all about the education, and maybe it's somewhat
well,
about
no,
the
I
long-term
don't think it's all
situation.
about the education, but I do think, and I think this goes back to part of what Kelly was saying. I think the mobs in France who didn't have that education, if they had had a better education than they did have, they might have thought before they joined the mob.
No, they
I
might
think
have,
they were just really desperate, angry people who had no food.
and
I
also
don't
wanted
think
someone else to take care of them, I think.
Right.
Whereas I think Americans, having come to America, and okay, so they're
more the
pre-American,
settler mentality, maybe.
had more of the, yeah, I can do it mentality. Whereas,
Well, but I
French
think they
peasants had
also
been
were
taken care
thinking
of for
more long term.
centuries.
I
A
think when
peasant who
you're
is used to,
uneducated and you're hungry and you're angry, you're not going to stop and think about what you're doing. You're just going to go do it.
oh yeah, you're gonna, yes,
Whereas
you have
when
nothing to
you're
lose. You feel you have nothing to lose.
in
and
the
you feel like you
U.S.
have nothing to gain afterwards.
There weren't people who were living on the street with nothing to eat because you could just go move and start a farm, and then you could grow food, and then you could eat.
It makes me wonder, because the people who fomented the French Revolution and the people who fomented the American Revolution, they cross-pollinated, they talked to each other a lot.
Well, and there were several French revolutions, so it's just going to be really confusing if you're listening, because I don't know which revolution we're specifically talking about at any point.
Well, I think I'm rolling all the French revolutions into one, even though they're all different, because I think they learned from each other.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, well, they definitely
did. The American Revolution was earlier. The American Revolution was earlier, and I just wonder if, as they watch the French Revolution turn into
our
chaos.
revolution happened after the fall of Napoleon, didn't it? No, it didn't.
And that was
it happened while Napoleon was in power, didn't it?
Yes. Because our revolution was 1776.
So France had a revolution, and that revolution had fallen.
Okay, I thought France had their revolution in 1790 something.
Their first
they definitely wanted to. You might be right. Maybe
they were definitely anti-English still at that point in time, and they were. This has been a really fascinating conversation, because we're not talking about feminism at all anymore.
Well, we're not talking about gumption either, but we're just talking about how we have this view.
So if you look up the French Revolution, just quickly before you go further, it just comes up with a period of far-reaching social and political upheaval in France that lasted from 1789 to 1799, so 10 years, partially carried forward by Napoleon during the later expansion of the French Empire. So it included him, and it went for 10 years, and they count that whole period as being one thing. Anyway, just so.
So we started it, and they may have thought they could do it, but their political situation was just different. Their population spread. Because if you're raised as a peasant to work on the land, although it was the Industrial Revolution, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution that really started to fuel it.
I know France lent generals and ammunition and stuff to the U.S. But I think also, I think they didn't think about the peasantry and the reaction the peasants would have to people fighting on their land and then expecting them to be able to grow the same amount of crops, to pay the same amount of taxes or even higher taxes, and still be able to survive and eat. So I think the French Revolution caused more French revolutions because the people who started the first one didn't realize that having a revolution was going to cause problems in terms of infrastructure.
Well, and just because we were talking about it and thinking about change and upheaval and unexpected things, like with Queen Victoria, that probably also opened up a space for the feminists to really start pushing, because it's not like there weren't women who said, hey, women should own their own property, women are equal people, but it's Mary Wollstonecraft who, I think Mary Wollstonecraft, she's Shelley too? I can't remember. But the mom of Mary Shelley actually wrote the very first British feminine treatise. I'm forgetting what it was called. The Vindication of the Rights of Women, or A Vindication of the Rights of Women.
That sounds familiar.
And then Mary Shelley went on to be very interesting.
Found the horror industry.
Pretty much.
I think it's so interesting that Mary Shelley's husband wrote like romantic poetry about like pretty landscapes and like emotions.
Yeah, and she wrote.
Anyways.
But yeah, she was definitely, when you think about everything that she probably experienced, it does make you wonder. I mean, when was Queen Victoria? Queen Victoria, was born when? Oh no.
She was born on 1819 to
Okay, so
1901.
she was born, right after some of those revolutionary times. So she was probably, there was probably concern in Britain among the monarchists that they might be next
Mm-hmm.
if they weren't stable. I mean, for all we know, that was one of the things that, you know, informed her leadership, I guess we could say.
So when she came into power, it says it was already an established constitutional monarchy in which the sovereign held relatively little direct political power. But privately, Victoria attempted to influence government policy and ministerial appointments. Publicly, she became a national icon who was identified with strict standards of personal morality.
And I think that's totally and completely up to the monarch, because I think, like we're talking about being charming and charismatic and being able to sway. I think a monarch that can sway, probably has the ear of everybody. She could grant favors, she could grant lands, she could grant titles. That wasn't Parliament's job. That was never Parliament's job. Basically, the monarch still gets to give out all the favors.
Mm.
And some monarchs know how to use that well.
Mm.
But
well,
I don't know, it sounds to me like they have to do so much going out in public. That would make me absolutely bonkers.
Imagine being an introvert and you're accidentally born into the royal family and you have to go
yeah, that hand wave. You do it better. I remember when my daughters, like Girl Scout troop, practiced that wave for a week. They would give each other that wave. No, you didn't do it right. You wiggled your fingers.
Hello! Not happening. All right, are we done for today?
I think we're done for today. Random history lesson.
Yeah.
So are we all agreed we don't want to be queens?
No, I wouldn't like it. It's too strict. There's too many rules.
It's on a lot of things.
Oh, it got dark, didn't it? Oh well. I should have put my light on.
All right. We will be back next week with another mystery topic from the jar
of mystery. See you next week.